Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, my concerns surrounding Karl-Anthony Towns' absence are largely based on offensive efficiency and versatility. However, there are some reasons for optimism, and that's mostly to do with some of the Wolves lineup data without Karl-Anthony Towns to this point in the season. We'll break down the whole thing next year. Welcome in. You are on Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Happy Thursday, everybody. The Timberwolves have a couple of days off here, which means we get to take a half step back and really take a larger view of the Wolves sans Karl-Anthony Towns. We haven't had much of a time to take a breath since the news that he'd be out for some time. Of course, he had the meniscus surgery on Monday, be reevaluated in 4 weeks, which is right at the tail end of the regular season. And the Wolves have had tons of games since then. So I want to look at some of my concerns and also some reasons for potential optimism as we enter this season of the Wolves season without Karl-Anthony Towns. That's what we'll focus today's show on. A big thank you off the top here for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. That's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. And a reminder about the postcasts. Of course, we cover the team every day, but we also give you instant episodes after every single game. You can check out the Locked On Wolves postcast. You can hear the audio right here on Locked On Wolves on the podcast feed. So a couple episodes ago would have been the postcast from Tuesday night's Clippers game. I actually hosted that one. I've hosted a handful this year. Typically, it's Luke Inman hosting with our good buddy Jack Borman, the editor-in-chief of Canis Hoopus, occasionally Tyler Metcalf from Canis Hoopus. So Luke and Jack, usually a bit of a rotating cast of characters at times. We stream that live after the games on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. And again, the audio will be right here on the Locked On Wolves audio feed. You can get rapid reaction to all the biggest moments following each game with the Locked On Wolves postcast. All right, so let's jump into this Wolves sans Cat discussion. And there's a lot of different ways we could take this. And we talked about it actually a little bit on the Minnesota basketball party on Wednesday, which again, also on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel and also in the audio feed here. If you're listening on audio, the episode before this one in your feed is the basketball party show from Wednesday. A few of us on the panel discussing concerns without having Karl-Anthony Towns. And my main concern on the show that I discussed, that I won't spend a ton of time here today, was related to Cat's versatility. And without Karl-Anthony Towns, the Timberwolves offense becomes more limited. It's just a fact that Towns is the most efficient offensive player on the Wolves and has the best combination of versatility and efficiency on the Wolves. Yes, Anthony Edwards has the higher ceiling and can do more things as a better ISO player, but Karl-Anthony Towns is truly efficient from everywhere on the floor, right? He's great at the rim. He can score on drives. He can spot up from three. He can handle the ball. He loves getting downhill from the perimeter. He loves playing off dribble handoffs and in isolation. He can post up. He can do all those things, and he does them all efficiently. And without Karl-Anthony Towns, Chris Finch's playbook becomes thinner. It's going to be a steady diet of pick and roll, a lot of spread pick and roll. Get Rudy, use Rudy's gravity to pull the defense toward the rim. And then, defenses have to make a choice, right? Are we sticking with Ant? Are we sticking with Rudy? And then you got spot up shooters around the perimeter, which is part of the challenge because you take out the best shooter on the team, who also is Karl-Anthony Towns. And now you're left with this starting lineup that we saw, the last couple of times out, or I guess not Sunday because he was out, but Kyle Anderson in the starting lineup and Jaden McDaniels with a complete lack of confidence of 11 over the past 2 games and is now shooting under 35%. What is he at? 34.4% for the season. So well below league average at this point. And if he's going to be, last year he was a 40% 3-point shooter, but a lot of this hinges on him and Kyle Anderson knocking down open shots. They have not done that this year, especially not Kyle Anderson, who was over 40% last year from three, and he's 21% from three this year. So that complicates things. Not only do you take away your most versatile offensive player, but you also take away your best shooter. And now it's Ant and it's Rudy, and the only spot-up shooter that can make you pay in the regular starting lineup at this point is Mike Conley, which is why we're going to see a little more Nickeil Alexander-Walker, which is why Naz Reid, there's a shot that Naz joins the starting lineup at some point. I know Chris Finch would rather use him in a sixth-man scoring role off the bench. But you got to start either Alexander Walker or Naz Reid, so you have at least two potent shooters on the floor with Ant and Rudy at basically all times, and it allows you to bring one of them off the bench still. So my hunch is, and we talked about this a little bit, I think on the basketball party and also the postcast with Jack the other night, if you bump Jaden McDaniels up to 4 and you start Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Anthony Edwards in the backcourt with Mike Conley, it's not ideal. You're not playing as big as you'd like to. It means you're relying on Jaden McDaniels to grab a few rebounds here and there, which he's also struggled to do with any real frequency and consistency. But it allows you to get another shooter on the floor. And then Kyle Anderson could still essentially run your second unit. Yeah, you can still play Jordan McLaughlin, who's actually been a really good three-point shooter this year. He's actually, by percentage, the Wolves' best three-point shooter, just a hair ahead of Mike Conley at this point. So that you can still play Kyle Anderson, Jordan McLaughlin off the bench. You can still, keep Naz on the floor with some of the bench unit. Or I guess in this scenario, Naz would be coming off the bench still because Nickeil Alexander-Walker would be in the starting lineup. So, and we can talk more about the lineup data here in a minute, but the limits that it places on Chris Finch's playbook, the ability, it just caps the ability to do too much with the playbook, with the absence of Karl-Anthony Towns, and it puts a lot more pressure on these guys who aren't shooting the ball as well as they did last year. And now you're looking at Mike Conley, Alexander Walker, who shot the lights out the other night, but overall this year hadn't been as good as last year, although he's been fine. Like, he's a little over league average at this point. It's those guys, right? Like, those guys, Jaden McDaniels has to make open threes, but otherwise you're looking at Conley and Alexander Walker as your only plus shooters, unless you want to include Jordan McLaughlin there. Edwards is a good 3-point shooter, but he's a volume shooter, right? He's hovering between 36 and 37% all year, and he's dangerous and he can shoot it from anywhere. It's a little bit more like D'Angelo Russell's a 3-point shooter, right? Where he's going to get him up and he can shoot from, wherever he wants. He can shoot from the logo if he wants to. He can get a shot off in any situation, and he can get hot at any point, but he's also more of a volume 3-point shooter than a knockdown catch and shoot guy like, say, Mike Conley or Karl-Anthony Towns. I want to talk about the efficiency challenges, and then so I've already talked about the versatility challenges. Let's talk about efficiency challenges, which is related, and then we could get into some encouraging factors. Just to introduce the idea of the efficiency challenges, the Timberwolves offense, I've already mentioned in passing Karl-Anthony Towns is their most efficient offensive player. There really isn't any debate about that. And I gave kind of the high level overview on that, right? He's just better than anybody else from anywhere on the floor. Effective field goal percentage wise, he's a hair below Conley and Reid and a ways below Gobert, because Gobert, he gets a lot of dunks, as it turns out. True shooting percentage, same deal. Only Rudy Gobert ahead of Karl-Anthony Towns, and actually Cat's got almost a 2-point advantage on the next best Wolf, who's Mike Conley. Cat is, 42% from 3. He's over 50% from the field, 55% from 2. He's having his best free throw shooting season at 87%. And free throw rate wise, Karl-Anthony Towns is finally, like, actually, I want to spend more time on that because that's maybe the biggest thing. He's gotten that. It was lower earlier this year. He's gotten it up to where it was last year. It's still not where it was a couple of years ago when he was getting to the line on nearly 40% of his, or that's not the right way to say that. Free throw rate is number of free throw attempts per field goal attempt. So for every field goal attempt, he was nearly averaging 0.4 free throws for every one field goal attempt, which is a great mark, right? It's not exactly Joel Embiid-esque, but it's great. That was 3 years ago. Actually, even last year. Or no, sorry. Yeah, 3 years ago. No, 2 years ago, 21-22, his last All-Star season before this one. Last year that dipped, and this year it's even lower, the free throw rate is, but it's getting higher. Still, that is a major component for the Wolves offense that has been lacking in the 4 games that Karl-Anthony Towns has missed since the announcement of the injury. So I want to dig into that a bit more and how the Wolves could combat that. Then I want to look at lineup data that suggests that they should be able to weather the storm on some level without Karl-Anthony Towns. We'll do all that here and next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 3 million members. They are the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. You pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch your winnings roll in. It's demon time on Prize Picks. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. $10 into $1,000. Demons and Goblins are the newest and most exciting way to play at Prize Picks. Squares marked with red demons or green goblins get you different payouts. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You can also play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, and you can find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries from some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each and every week. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks.com/LockedOnNBA. That's code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. As you well know, at this point, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel, Locked On Sports Today. And baseball fans, mark your calendars, March 20th. That's a week from yesterday, next Wednesday, at 7 Eastern, 6 Central for the best MLB season preview, coming exclusively to Locked On Sports Today. March 20th at 7 Eastern, 6 Central. You can be the first to get local insight from the MLB local experts of the Locked On Podcast Network. That's next Wednesday, March 20th. On the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Okay, so talking Karl-Anthony Towns and the concerns that I have related to a lack of efficiency in the Wolves offense. And I mentioned free throw rate. And while Cat's free throw rate is not where it has been in recent years, compared to other guys on the Wolves, it's still really important, right? The only guys with higher free throw rates individually on the Wolves are Anthony Edwards, who's just slightly higher, Kyle Anderson, believe it or not, because his volume of shots is so low, and among rotation guys, Rudy Gobert. I'm not going to count Minot or Luka Garza, but Rudy Gobert has a much higher free throw rate because teams are trying to wrap him up when he's around the rim, obviously. And then it's only Kyle Anderson and Anthony Edwards with higher free throw rates than Karl-Anthony Towns. And nobody else is even close, by the way. Cat's over a 0.3. So more than 0.3 free throw attempts per 1 field goal attempt. Nobody else is above a 0.2. Nas is the next closest at 0.171. Okay. So the only guys getting to the line for the Wolves are Cat, Ant, and Rudy. And Kyle Anderson, just based on his volume of shots, he gets fouled a fair amount. So that's a bit of a problem in and of itself. And the Wolves, as an offense, their offensive free throw rate, though, is still 6th in the league in terms of how often they're getting to the line, or actually it's 5th in the league. So they're top 5 in free throw rate. And it's been one of the reasons the offense has been at least competitive at times this year. Still middle of the pack, still kind of languishing in the 15 to 20 range in terms of their league rating all season. Their offensive rating is. And they don't, there's a lot of things they don't do well, right? They turn it over a bunch. They don't grab a ton of offensive rebounds, although they did against the Clippers, the Clippers on Tuesday. But if you just look at the games they've played since Karl-Anthony Towns went out, okay, so going back to the Pacers game. Now, it's also the start of the road trip. So going back to last Thursday, it would have been at Indiana. And if you look at, so I like looking at cleaning the glass. If we look at the recent, essentially the game log for the team and the 4 factors on cleaning the glass, they shade all the boxes to show you like percentile of each category for the game, right? So like, for instance, last game, the Timberwolves against the Clippers, their points per 100 possessions was 134.9 points per 100 possessions is how they played offensively. Essentially, their offensive rating for the game against the Clippers. That would be 93rd percentile, right? That's a really good offensive game. The game prior against the Lakers, 109.4 points per 100 possessions, 29th percentile, okay? So you get the picture. So if it's the closer it is to 100th percentile, the more orange the box is. The closer it is to 0, the more blue the box is. And you look at the last 4 games, and 3 of the 4 free throw rate boxes for their offense are blue, 12th percentile, 7th percentile, 24th percentile. The Cleveland game is essentially neutral, 54th percentile. So an easier way to say that, or I guess what that's telling us is over the last 4 games, their free throw rate as a team has been extremely low. If you look at the 4 games before that, it's all orange, real orange. And in fact, you take like a 10-game sample before that, and 8 of the 10 games are orange. There's only 2 that are blue. This is a really crude way of looking at this, but I think you get what I'm saying. Karl-Anthony Towns has a massive impact on the Timberwolves offense, on the Timberwolves offense's ability to draw fouls. And a lot of it is Cat individually drawing fouls, but it's also, I used this word earlier about Rudy, but it's the gravity that Cat creates wherever he is on the floor that then allows Anthony Edwards to get a mismatch or to avoid a double team to then make it easier for him to draw a foul or whatever that looks like, right? It just it greases the wheels of the offense. They're headed in the wrong direction free throw rate wise, and Cat's absence is a big reason for that. Side note, the other end of the floor, they're also headed in the wrong direction. They were top 10 for a long stretch this season in terms of avoiding fouls on defense, and they've plummeted now. According to Basketball Reference, they're 20th in defensive free throw rate. And again, same thing on cleaning the glass. Like you look at their last 4 games, they're in the blue the last 4 games. They've been committing a ton of fouls or really allowing opponents to shoot a ton of free throws against them. I worry a little bit about the Rudy factor and what happened. I've said this a couple times before on various shows. But the conscious or perhaps subconscious bias of officials against Rudy and the Timberwolves could only increase after what Rudy's allegations last Friday. And we've seen that over the last. Now, the Lakers get to the line a ton, period. The Clippers do as well. So, maybe it's more the opponent than anything else. And I'm willing to accept that as what's likely happening, but it's something to monitor. It's been a problem over the last 4 games. And of course, the Wolves have gone 2-2 over the last 4 games. So free throws are one concern, but one of the ways they could combat that, and this is where I start to turn things back to the positive side, and we'll get to the lineup data here in a minute, is that the Timberwolves have been a better transition team, or they're more likely to run without Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. And for the season, they're second to last in the NBA in transition frequency. They're 29th. They run in transition, according to Cleaning the Glass, on just 12.8% of possessions. Only Chicago runs less frequently than Minnesota. However, the Timberwolves are number 1 in efficiency in transition. They score 134.8 points per 100 transition plays. Number 1. So second to last in frequency, number 1 in efficiency. And they're more likely to run without Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. Now, the one thing that concerns me there is Cat does draw a lot of fouls, and he's the best shooter on the team. And he can get trail threes in transition, and he can get fouled in transition, but he's usually not one of the first guys down the floor, right? So he can get hit a trail 3 in almost what turns into a secondary break type situation. And I guess those are probably still logged as transition shots in this case. But we're talking Anthony Edwards in transition. We're talking, Mike Conley getting down the floor. He doesn't shoot a whole lot of pull-up threes in transition, but the ability to do that. Pushing to corner threes for Nas, for Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Nas getting out in transition himself. Lobs to Rudy in transition. And those are all in play now. And Chris Finch alluded to this shortly after Cat got hurt. I think it was like right after the injury was announced last week. And Finch said, hey, we're going to run more. And I'm not saying the personnel is better to run more without Karl-Anthony Towns, but their half-court personnel is worse, right? And when's the most efficient and effective time to score? It's in transition, when you're not playing against a set defense, and you're more likely to get a foul, and you're more likely to get an open 3. So even though you're missing your most efficient player, if you then use the personnel you have and push into more advantageous situations like a fast break, and it's not the same personnel as the 21-22 Wolves that ran all the time, that were so high in pace and played a high variance, high turnover game on defense with Jared Vanderbilt and Patrick Beverley and D'Angelo Russell and Malik Beasley. This isn't that personnel, but Anthony Edwards can run, right? Nickeil Alexander-Walker can run. Jordan McLaughlin likes to push pace. Like, they've got guys who are comfortable doing this. And this was already a frankly poor half-court offensive team, even with Karl-Anthony Towns. It's not going to get better without him. And I said this on the basketball party on Wednesday. So how do you claw back some of those opportunities, some of those scoring opportunities, and make them more efficient opportunities? It's scoring in transition, which, again, I'll repeat this. They're the best transition offense in the entire league this year in terms of points per play, points per 100 plays. They just don't do it enough. And Cleveland Glass also breaks down when they run. They're dead last in running off of live rebounds, off of defensive rebounds, but they actually are top 10 in they're middle of the pack in frequency in running off of steals, but they're still top 10 in points per play, of course, in both, because they're number 1 overall. So when they run off of steals, which they do a little more frequently, they're effective. And when they run off rebounds, which they never do, they only run basically 20% of the time, which, by the way, they're easily dead last in running off of defensive rebounds. They only do it on 20.8% of plays. Chicago's 22.5%. That's almost 2 points higher, two percentage points higher in terms of frequency for the Bulls. So the Wolves just aren't running. They did it a little bit against the Clippers, and they needed to. And it's something they just are going to have to do a little bit more of as they get, in the playoffs. It's a bit like in the playoffs, you're playing more of a half-court game anyway, which does suit the Wolves defensively. And I think will work out. Like, I think the Wolves will be okay in the playoffs, even without Karl-Anthony Towns, if it needs to be in the first round, because their half-court defense is so good. But right now, they need to play around with scoring more in transition. It's got to be a part of what they're doing here moving forward. I want to close by looking at some lineup data and peeking ahead at the schedule. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our sponsors at Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you could still have an IRA? Robinhood is the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on that 3% match either. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at Robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations applied to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC member SIPC is a registered broker-dealer. All right, let's talk a little bit about some lineup data sans Karl-Anthony Towns. And I mentioned this in passing at some point last week. I believe Zach Lowe had touched on this like in passing in one of his articles last week. I think it was his 10 Things article right after the cat injury, before we knew the full scope of it, was talking about the Wolves and how they've actually been fairly successful in possessions without Karl-Anthony Towns. And that's true. With Cat off the floor and Ant and Rudy on the floor. This is like, we'll talk about more than just this scenario, but this is the most important scenario in my mind, because you're not always going to have them both on the floor, Ant and Rudy, but you are when it matters, right? You're going to start the game that way. You're certainly going to end the game that way, and that's going to be your best lineup. With Ant and Rudy on the floor together, the Timberwolves offense right now, this includes data through the Clippers game on Tuesday, is a plus 14 in nearly 1,200 possessions. That would be a 98th percentile offense. Or not offense, team, like unit, straight up, like not just offense. 98th percentile in terms of their net rating, a plus 14. Defensively, they allow just 100.8 points per 100 possessions, which is incredible. It's incredible. I'll give some context on that. For the season so far, overall, the Timberwolves have the number 1 defense. And as a team, they're allowing just 108.7 points per possession. Now it's nearly 3 points better. It's 2.9 points better than the second and third best teams, who are tied, Boston and Cleveland. Nearly 3 points better on defense as a team. But as a unit with Ant and Rudy together, 100.8 points per 100 possessions. It's just incredible how good that unit has been defensively, or any unit with Ant and Rudy together. Offensively, they've been fine. It kind of mirrors the Wolves overall this season. 46th percentile, 114.8 points per possession. Which, by the way, like, let's flip this. Let's include Karl-Anthony Towns and look at what that offensive number turns into. So 46th percentile, Rudy and Ant together offensively without Karl-Anthony Towns. With Karl-Anthony Towns, that unit goes up to 87th percentile, 121 points per possession. Okay? Now, And the defense is still good. It's 111.3 points per possession defensively with Ant and Rudy. So a couple ways to look at this. Number one, I think the biggest thing here is that Cat is instrumental to the Wolves offense. And we knew that, but these numbers bear that out, right? They go from 44th percentile offense with Rudy and Ant and no Cat to 87th percentile if you include Cat. The defense goes down a little from 100th percentile to 87th percentile. And that backs up what I think I would have told you before ever looking at the numbers. Karl-Anthony Towns has been good defensively this year. But some of their units without him have been even better because they're just more defensively versatile. However, their offense has been indisputably worse without Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. And without him, that half-court offense that I worried about in the last segment and implored the Wolves to do more in transition to try and avoid some of these half-court offense situations sans Cat, it's just not as good without Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. There's no question about that. In terms of those individual lineups, the one that's most used, by the way, without Cat, but with Ant and Rudy, is actually a negative 6.6, the most used lineup. That's Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Anderson, and Gobert. Oh, by the way, that's the starting lineup that they used against the Clippers and in the loss against Cleveland last week. That's, last year's lineup at the end of the season without Karl-Anthony Towns, like after the Conley trade without Towns when he was still out. So that lineup, it's only 196 possessions. But it's what? It's almost 20% of the possessions that they've played without Cat, that Ant and Rudy have played without Cat, is a 24th percentile unit as of right now. But if you flip out Kyle Anderson for Naz Reid in 150 possessions, that unit is a plus 16.7, 82nd percentile. Okay? So Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Anderson, Gobert. Starting lineup from Tuesday and from the Cleveland game. 24th percentile, minus 6.6 overall differential. Switch out Naz for slow-mo. It's an 82nd percentile unit, plus 16.7 overall. The offense isn't very good in either scenario, actually, which is interesting. It goes back to my point earlier about shooting. But the defense is so much better. This surprised me. The defense is so much better with Naz on the floor, not Kyle Anderson. Because conventional wisdom, and by that I mean, I don't know why I said it that way, but like the chatter and the assumption is that, Chris Finch wants to have the length of defense of Kyle Anderson out there. And there's other things here too. Like it depends on who they're playing against, right? So if Slow-Mo's also playing against opposing, like look at it this way. I want to be fair because Slow-Mo's still a good player. I don't want to turn this into a Slow-Mo bashing session. And you can find that if you want that information. If you want to find a Slow-Mo bashing session, just visit Twitter, visit X, right? He's still a good player. Consider this, the first quarter of the Clippers game when the Wolves got crushed, Kawhi was on the floor and so was Kyle Anderson for the majority of that quarter. Naz played most of his minutes without Kawhi on the floor again and plays more minutes against backups than Kyle Anderson. Like we have to consider that, certainly. But the Naz unit actually has been better defensively than the Slow-Mo unit. But then the whole thing goes back to my point in the first segment of the show today, which is the lack of shooting is the concern here. Because neither one of those units, even the one with Naz Reid, has been good offensively. It's a relatively limited sample, but we're still talking over 150 possessions for each of these units. The one sandwich between, in terms of frequency used, is the one that's been the best. And it's 183 possessions. So nearly as much as the starting lineup from the game the other day. And it's a unit without Mike Conley. It's Ant and Alexander Walker in the backcourt, Kyle Anderson at the 3, Naz Reid at the 4, and Rudy still on the floor. That surprised me. And it's basically right now the bench unit, right? And putting Slow-Mo at the 3, which like I've kind of talked back and forth on this. Slow-Mo's better at the 4 overall, but the Wolves may be a better team, just put simply, when Naz and Rudy are on the floor, and Ant's obviously still on the floor. So then how are you filling the rest of the spots? And as of right now, Alexander Walker on the floor instead of Conley, and Kyle Anderson playing the 3 instead of Jaden McDaniels has been a better lineup. It's a plus 35 in 183 possessions. That's a 98th percentile unit. Again, relatively small sample. Cat's played a lot of minutes this year. But it's not a nothing sample, and we're going to see a lot more of it. It's a 90th percentile offense, which absolutely floored me. And I'm sure that some of the runs in the Clippers game skews this a little bit, but we're still talking about a few dozen possessions out of 183. It's not the majority of the possessions. We're not talking about 15 total possessions. So there's a bit of a body of work here. The 90th percentile offense, 131 points per 100 possessions, and a 97th percentile defense, 96.2 points per 100 possessions. And again, that's Ant, Alexander Walker, Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid, and Rudy Gobert. So if you thought this was a slow-mo bashing session, you needed to listen all the way through the segment, because he's still a contributing player to the Wolves. Should he be starting? That's another question. And I said this early in the show. I would support, depending on the matchup, Slow-Mo coming off the bench and Naz Reid coming off the bench and starting a smaller lineup with Nicky Alexander-Walker, just somewhat reinventing how they're going to play. I don't think they have to play the same way they did for 50-plus games without Cat last year, because it was only moderately successful. It's not like the offense was a bottom 10 offense, right? So try some different stuff. Now that Alexander Walker is more confident in his offensive game, Mike Conley's done more this year offensively and more comfortable in better shape, I think, overall than he was late last year. Rudy's it's just a bit of a different team than it was 12 months ago, 11 months, or I guess 13 months ago in the middle of Cat's injury last year. So I just hope Chris Finch, I'm sure he's thinking about all these things. I'm sure the coaching staff is thinking about all these things, but they just need to execute. They need to run more. They need to pay attention to this lineup data that suggests that Kyle Anderson, he's still usable, but in the right situation. And the key thing is just Ant and Rudy minutes together as much as possible. All right. That's all we have for you today. Might get a little bit more to some lineup stuff Friday. I certainly want to preview the matchup that the Wolves have with the Jazz. We haven't seen Utah in quite a while, so we'll talk about what they've been up to, what that matchup looks like. That game is Saturday night, but we'll preview it on Friday, and a few lineup things I didn't quite get to today that we'll get to on Friday's show. A big thank you for making this show your first listen every single day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota channel on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.